Chapter 5. As David's footsteps echoed down the hall, Melanie sunk to the floor, her knees weak from the emotional turmoil. She watched the empty doorway, half expecting David to come back and tell her it was all a cruel joke. But the house remained silent, save for the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. The silence was a reminder of the reality. David was gone. She wrapped her arms around herself, tears welling up in her eyes. The room felt colder now, the emptiness grating at her senses. It wasn't just the physical absence of David, but the laughter, the shared secrets, the comforting presence, all gone. It was as if a piece of her had left with David. But as the tears spilled down her cheeks, she remembered David's words. He deserved better. He deserved a life where he was valued, respected, and loved. And this house, under her mother's scornful gaze, could never give him that. With a deep breath, Melanie stood up. It was a painful reality to accept, but she knew she had to be strong for David. He wouldn't want her moping around all day, and they had both known that this was bound to happen eventually. Ever since that time, Sheila had beaten David so badly that he had to go to the emergency room, just a few weeks after he was adopted. "I'll miss you, David," she whispered into the empty room. Her voice was small, but filled with determination. "I won't forget you." She wiped away her tears, a newfound resolve in her eyes. David's departure was a wake-up call. She couldn't let her mother's bitterness define their lives. She had to stand up, not just for herself, but for David too. His brave decision had shown her that they both deserved better, and she was ready to fight for it. The room felt different now. It was no longer just a room, but a symbol of their journey, their struggles, and their hopes. It was a reminder of the bond that they shared, not bound by blood, but by their unwavering support for each other. Even though David was gone, she knew he was with her in spirit. His resilience, his kindness, his resolve, they were a part of her now, and she would carry them with her. With a final glance at the room, Melanie stepped out. Feeling the weight of the day's events, Melanie felt her strength leave her. She trudged back to her room, her heart heavy with grief. Once she reached the refuge of her bed, she let her tears flow freely, crying herself to sleep. Chapter 6. "David!" Sheila's voice echoed through the now silent house, piercing the quiet stillness that had settled. The annoyance was evident in her tone as she demanded David to clean the floors to make up for the scene he had caused. She was oblivious to the reality of David's absence. He was no longer there to answer her calls or clean the home. She waited for a moment, expecting to hear the familiar shuffling of David's feet, the soft murmur of his apology. But the house remained eerily quiet, except for the clock's ticking that grew louder and more pronounced in David's absence. The silence irked her. She was not used to being ignored, especially not by David. Confused and irritated by his apparent disobedience, Sheila decided to take matters into her own hands. Marching down the hallway, her mind was already forming a string of reprimands for David's lack of response. As she reached David's room, she was met with a sight that completely shocked her. The room, usually filled with David's quiet presence and sparse belongings, was empty. His bed was neatly made and his few belongings were all gone. The room looked untouched, devoid of any signs of life, as if it had been abandoned. For a few moments, Sheila stood frozen at the doorway, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality. She had thought David's talk of leaving was nothing more than a teenage tantrum, a momentary lapse of judgment. She had never believed that he would actually leave. The realization hit her like a freight train. David was gone. He had left, just as he said he would. As the truth sunk in, Sheila felt a pang of regret for the first time in a long time. She hadn't thought that he would actually leave. She had lost her servant, the target of her frustrations, her personal punching bag. What now? Seething with anger, Sheila paced around the empty room, her mind whirling with emotions. "Ungrateful brat," she muttered, her voice echoing in the empty room. "Doesn't he realize how much I've done for him?" The words hung heavily in the air, filling the room with bitterness and resentment. Sheila scoffed, her gaze sweeping over the room. "I gave him a roof over his head, food to eat, a place to belong, and this is how he repays me? By leaving?" Her voice rose with each word, the sting of betrayal evident in her tone. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. "He was nothing before I took him in. Nothing but a burden. A charity case." She spat out the words as if they had left a bitter taste in her mouth. The reality of her own words echoed in her mind, a stark reminder of the unspoken truth that lay beneath her harsh exterior. She let out a bitter laugh. "And to think, I thought he'd at least be helpful with caring for the home, hoped that he wouldn't be completely useless." Her gaze hardened as she continued her bitter monologue, the sharp edge of her words cutting through the room's silence. "But he's just trash. Worthless, ungrateful trash. He's just like his parents, always doing what they want without any crumb of consideration for me." Her voice was filled with venom, her resentment clear in every syllable. But beneath the surface, a flicker of regret and longing resonated. David's departure had brought to light a reality she was not ready to face: her dependence on him. Her anger slowly gave way to a cold sense of loss as she continued pacing. Her personal servant, her verbal punching bag, was gone. And despite her harsh words and bitterness, she couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling of emptiness that David's departure had left in its wake. The house felt larger, quieter, and somehow colder. Every corner of the house echoed with his absence, every uncompleted task a reminder of his departure. The emptiness gnawed at her, a bitter pill she was forced to swallow. It was a reality that she had not anticipated, a reality that she was not prepared for. Chapter 7. David stepped out into the early morning light, the cool breeze brushing against his face. He looked around, taking in the familiar sights one last time. It was the neighborhood he had grown up in, the place he had called home. But now, it was time for him to leave it all behind. David began his journey with a small, worn-out bag slung over his shoulder. His destination was unclear, his future uncertain. But he was driven by a sense of purpose, a desire to find a place where he was valued, respected, and accepted. As he walked further, David couldn't help but look back again at the house he had just left. It was where he had grown up, the place he had shared countless memories with Melanie. It was a place that had given him both pain and comfort, but it was no longer his home. Not anymore. Despite the heaviness in his heart, David felt a sense of relief. He was no longer under Sheila's constant scrutiny, no longer bound by her unreasonable expectations. He was free to shape his future and carve out his own path. And that thought filled him with a sense of hope and determination. With a renewed sense of purpose, David stepped into a world of endless possibilities. The first thing he had to do was find a safe place to stay. Over the years, he'd been prudent enough to hide away a modest amount from the various odd jobs he took up around town. The money wasn't substantial, but it should be sufficient to afford him a few nights at a local hotel. The opportunity to spend a few nights in the solitude of a hotel would offer him the much-needed breathing room, the silence of the hotel would be a welcome contrast to the constant barrage of Sheila's bitter words. It would provide a serene environment where he could calmly strategize his next steps, charting out a course for his life that was yet to be explored. His heart filled with anticipation, David headed towards his destination, the Rising Phoenix Hotel. It was not too far from where he was, just a few miles away and nestled in the heart of the town. It was a place he had heard of before from Sheila, the place she had met his parents for the first time. The name of the hotel resonated with him deeply. It was almost symbolic, mirroring his own life at the moment. Like the mythical phoenix rising from the ashes, he too was commencing a new journey, born from the remnants of his troubled past. The thought filled him with a sense of determination and hope. He was leaving behind a life of servitude and embarking on a path of self-discovery and independence. The promise of a life where he could make his own decisions, free from Sheila's harsh criticisms and constant scorn, filled him with an exhilarating sense of freedom. As he walked towards the heart of the city, he allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. It was the first step towards his new life. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges along the way, but he was ready to face them, armed with the strength that living under Sheila's roof had instilled in him. The Rising Phoenix Hotel was not just a place for him to rest. It was the beacon that marked the beginning of his new journey. Chapter 8. As David approached the Rising Phoenix Hotel, he admired the beautiful design, the grandeur of the entrance, the gleaming glass doors welcoming the guests, the uniformed staff bustling around. It all spoke of a luxury that David had only ever dreamt of. However, as David stepped through the entrance, a sense of unease settled over him. The opulent lobby, with its plush furnishings and tastefully curated artwork, was far from the modest inn he had imagined. With a sense of trepidation, he approached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a warm smile, greeted him politely. "How may I assist you today?" she asked. I need a room," David stammered, feeling incredibly out of place amidst the hotel's grandeur. "Certainly," the receptionist replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she pulled up the room rates. "Our standard room is available at $800 per night. Would you like to book one?" David felt his heart drop at her words. $800 per night? He had hoped to stretch his modest savings for a few days, maybe even a week, not just one night. He had been naive to think that a hotel in the heart of the city, with a grand name like Rising Phoenix, would be within his budget. I can't afford that," David confessed, his voice barely a whisper. The receptionist looked at him with a sympathetic smile, but did nothing to ease the sinking feeling in his stomach. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her tone professional yet kind. "But that's the best rate we can offer." Feeling his face heat up with embarrassment, David mumbled a quiet apology and quickly left the hotel. As he stepped back into the sunlight, he felt as though he had been slapped by a cold reality. He was on his own now, with no home, no safety net, and a very small budget. Just as David was about to leave the premises, he heard a voice call out behind him. He turned around to see the receptionist running towards him, a look of panic on her face. "Wait!" she called out, panting slightly. "There's a room that just became available. It's being remodeled and it's almost complete. It's not furnished yet and there are still some touch-ups to do, so it wasn't supposed to be available until next month." She caught her breath before continuing. "You could stay there for free if you'd like. Would you like to come back in?" David was taken aback by the receptionist's sudden proposal. He stood there, rooted to the spot. As a wave of thoughts crashed over him, it was an unexpected lifeline, a sliver of hope in a rapidly spiraling situation. His initial reaction was one of suspicion. It seemed too good to be true. A free room in a hotel that was clearly out of his budget? His mind began to race with possibilities, each more daunting than the last. Was this a trap? Was there a catch he wasn't aware of? But the other part of him, the part that was teetering on the brink of desperation, urged him to consider the offer. He was alone, with no home to return to, and unlikely to find another place by nightfall. The prospect of spending the night on the streets was becoming more real by the minute. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He looked at the receptionist, her face genuinely concerned. He didn't know her and had no reason to trust her, but right now, he had little choice. "All right," he finally said, managing a slight smile. "I'll come back in." Upon David's acceptance of her offer, the receptionist swiftly regained her composure. Her face, previously marked with worry, now bore a professional demeanor. She nodded at David and motioned for him to follow her back into the hotel. As they walked through the grand entrance, the intimidating opulence of the lobby seemed less daunting. The immaculate marble floors, the ornate chandeliers, the plush furnishings, and the curated artwork that had initially overwhelmed David now seemed less imposing. The receptionist treated him with a level of courtesy and professionalism fit for honored guests, politely offering him a beverage and guiding him through the lobby and towards the elevators at a sure and steady pace, while listing the hotel's various amenities. Her attention to him made him feel valued, a feeling he had been yearning for. This treatment, which was so different from what he had experienced under Sheila's roof, offered him a glimmer of hope. Despite the uncertainty ahead, being treated with dignity and respect gave him the comfort he desperately needed in that moment.